Tonight, we are talking about why faith exists. Tonight, we're talking about the origin of belief itself. Here's the thing about faith, it's like Wi-Fi. Nobody can see it, but everyone gets angry when it's not working. You're lying in bed right now. Maybe it's late, maybe you're tired, and you're about to learn something unsettling. Your brain is lying to you. It's been lying to you since before you could walk. Every time you thought you heard someone call your name in an empty house, every time you felt watched in the dark, every time you sensed meaning in coincidence, that wasn't intuition. That was your hyperactive agency detection device misfiring, the same ancient alarm system that kept your ancestors from being eaten by lions. And here's the really uncomfortable part. That same glitchy mechanism might be responsible for every god humanity has ever worshipped. You probably won't survive this documentary without questioning something fundamental about how your mind works. As we continue, take a second to subscribe if you want to see more documentaries like this, but only if you genuinely enjoy. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, what time it is there, and whether you think faith is hardwired or learned. We genuinely want to know what's on your mind. Now, enjoy the music and visuals, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the dark. Not metaphorically, literally standing in darkness, maybe 70,000 years ago, somewhere on the African savanna where the stars are so bright they hurt. You hear something, a crack in the underbrush. Your heartbeat accelerates before your conscious mind even registers the sound. Was it wind? Was it a branch falling? Or was it something with teeth, something with intention, something that wants to eat you? Your brain doesn't wait for certainty. It assumes agency. It assumes someone or something is there, watching, waiting, hunting. This split-second paranoia is what kept your ancestors alive long enough to become your ancestors. The ones who assumed it was just wind got eaten. The ones who assumed monsters survived to reproduce. You inherited their jumpy, suspicious, pattern-seeking brains. Fast forward to tonight. You're alone in your house and you hear a floorboard creak upstairs. Nobody's home. You know nobody's home, but your brain whispers, someone's there. That's the same ancient software running, the same hyperactive agency detection device, the same evolutionary paranoia that once saved lives. Except now, in the safety of your modern home, it's creating ghosts where there's only settling wood. And here's where it gets interesting. That exact same mental mechanism, the one that makes you hear footsteps in empty rooms, might be the reason humans invented gods. Anthropologist Stuart Guthrie spent years studying why humans see faces in clouds, hear voices in wind, and find intention in randomness. His big insight, published in his book Faces in the Clouds, back in 1993, was deceptively simple. We're wired to see agents everywhere because other humans and animals are the most important things in our environment. Missing a predator kills you. Missing a potential ally costs you survival advantages. So, evolution built us to err on the side of caution, to see minds and intentions even when they're not there. The cost of a false positive thinking there's an agent when there isn't is just wasted energy and maybe some embarrassment. The cost of a false negative thinking there's no agent when there actually is one is death. Think about the last time you were genuinely scared alone at night. Maybe your power went out, maybe you were camping, maybe you just felt that inexplicable sensation of being watched. Your rational mind knows the statistics. You're almost certainly safe. Intruders are rare. The odds of actual danger are minuscule. But your ancient brain doesn't care about statistics. It cares about survival. And for survival purposes, paranoia works. Better to flee from 10 shadows than ignore one predator. This is called the smoke detector principle. It's better for your smoke detector to go off for burnt toast 100 times than to fail once during an actual fire. Now imagine you're not alone in the dark. You're with your tribe, huddled around a fire while something growls just beyond the light. You can't see it, but you can feel its presence. Your agency detection is screaming. Everyone else's is screaming too. Someone says, "There's a spirit out there. It's angry. We need to appease it." They throw meat into the darkness. The growling stops. The leopard was hungry, ate the meat, and left. But your tribe doesn't know that. What they know is, we acknowledged the angry spirit, we gave it an offering, and it left us alone. Do that enough times, add some ritual, pass it down through generations, and suddenly you have the beginnings of religion. Historians still argue whether this agency detection really explains the origin of all religious belief, or if it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Some scholars think we're oversimplifying. After all, detecting agents is one thing, building elaborate theological systems with moral codes and creation myths is quite another. But the basic mechanism is hard to deny. Your brain is a pattern-seeking, agent-detecting machine that would rather see intention where there is none than misintention where there is some. Here's a quirky detail most people don't know. Researchers have actually tested this in labs. They show people ambiguous images, random shapes, flickering lights, and ask what they see. When people are anxious or feel less control over their environment, they report seeing faces and intentional patterns more often. When people feel safe and in control, the effect decreases. Religion, it turns out, spikes when life gets unpredictable. Your brain creates agents to explain the unexplainable, and in explaining it, gains a sense of control. Even if that control is an illusion, it feels better than chaos. You're not special in this regard. Every human who has ever lived has had this same glitchy software running in their skull. That's why every culture, from the most isolated tribes in the Amazon to the most advanced technological societies, has some form of supernatural belief. Not because gods are obviously real in a way everyone can verify, but because human brains are universally bad at distinguishing actual agents from perceived ones. We see faces in outlet sockets, hear meaning in random noise, and feel presence in empty spaces. And from that fundamental cognitive bias, we built cathedrals and temples and entire civilizations. You're transported back about 12,000 years, long before pyramids or cities or writing, to a barren hillside in southeastern Turkey, near a place that would eventually be called Göbekli Tepe. You're not an archaeologist yet. You're a shepherd, and you just kicked a strange stone sticking up from the earth. It's not a rock, it's carved, intricately carved. This is 1994. And you've just accidentally discovered something that will force humanity to rewrite the entire story of civilization. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrives a year later, starts digging, and uncovers something impossible. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some reaching 6 meters tall and weighing over 50 tons, arranged in precise circles. They're covered with carvings, lions with bared teeth, foxes mid-stride, scorpions, vultures, abstract symbols nobody can decode. The site spans multiple circular structures, and only about 10% has been excavated so far. The stone circles descend in layers, suggesting the site was used, buried, built over, and repeated for thousands of years. And here's the part that breaks the textbooks. Göbekli Tepe dates to 9500 BCE. That's 11,500 years ago, before farming, before pottery, before permanent settlements, before civilization was supposed to exist. The old story you learned in school went like this. First came agriculture, then food surplus, then leisure time, then social hierarchy, then someone built temples. Cause and effect, nice and linear. Göbekli Tepe laughs at that story. This temple was built by hunter-gatherers who still chased wild gazelles and gathered wild grains. No evidence of domesticated wheat, no ceramic pots, no houses, just these massive, inexplicable stone monuments in the middle of nowhere, requiring hundreds of workers to quarry limestone from a distant ridge, transport it without wheels or draft animals, carve intricate reliefs without metal tools, and erect pillars that would challenge modern construction. Equipment. Schmidt, who died in 2014 after dedicating his life to the site, had a provocative theory. First came the temple, then the city. Religion, he argued, didn't follow civilization. Religion created it. Think about the logistics. You need to feed hundreds of workers for months or years. You need to organize labor, establish hierarchies, coordinate schedules, store food. You need reasons for strangers from different bands to cooperate on a project that offers no immediate survival benefit. What could possibly motivate scattered hunter-gatherer groups to invest that kind of energy? Faith. Or, more specifically, shared belief in something transcendent enough to justify the sacrifice. Schmidt believed Göbekli Tepe was a pilgrimage site, a sacred mountain where groups gathered for rituals, feasts, and ceremonies that bound them together. And maybe, just maybe, the social organization required to maintain these gatherings, the need to feed pilgrims, the incentive to increase food production, sparked the agricultural revolution. The temple came first. The farm came second. Historians still argue whether Schmidt's interpretation is correct, or if we're projecting modern religious categories onto ancient stones. Some archaeologists think Göbekli Tepe might have been a gathering place for trade or social exchange, not necessarily religious, in any sense we'd recognize. But even the skeptics admit the site is extraordinary. No defensive walls, no living quarters, no trash heaps from daily life, just monumental architecture with symbolic carvings repeated across centuries, clearly meaning something profound to the people who built it. Here's a detail that sounds almost made up. The stones are aligned to astronomical events. The carvings seem to reference constellations. One pillar features a comet or asteroid impact, possibly recording a real celestial event. These people were tracking the sky with enough precision to memorialize it in stone. They were asking big questions about their place in the cosmos, about cycles and permanence and what lies beyond the visible. That's the stuff religion is made of. And here's the really wild part that keeps archaeologists up at night. Göbekli Tepe isn't unique. Across the region, more sites keep appearing. Karahan Tepe, Nebali Kori, dozens of others, all dating to the same pre-agricultural period, all featuring similar T-shaped pillars and animal carvings. It's looking less like one anomalous temple and more like an entire network of sacred sites, a prehistoric religious movement spanning generations and covering vast territories. These people were coordinating beliefs and rituals across distances that should have been impossible for nomadic bands. Something held them together. Something made them care about continuity across lifetimes. You're standing in front of one of these pillars now, at night under the same stars those ancient builders saw. You run your hand over the carved limestone, feeling the grooves of a fox's tail, the curve of a serpent. Whoever carved this has been dead for over 100 centuries. Their language is lost, their names are forgotten, but their question remains, frozen in stone. What do we owe to the powers beyond our understanding? How do we make sense of forces larger than ourselves? The mainstream historical consensus now acknowledges that Göbekli Tepe fundamentally changed our understanding of human development. The Smithsonian Magazine called it the world's first temple, and National Geographic documented its implications for the origin of civilization. Stanford archaeologist Ian Hodder, one of the most respected names in the field, stated bluntly, "This shows sociocultural changes come first. Agriculture comes later. You can make a good case. This area is the real origin of complex Neolithic societies." But here's the question that Göbekli Tepe raises and doesn't answer. Did the people who built this believe in gods before they started carving? Or did the act of building together, moving stones together, feasting together, create the feeling that something sacred was present? Did they dance around fires because they believed in spirits? Or did the ecstasy of communal dance generate the idea of spirits? Which came first, the ritual or the belief? Maybe it's not an either-or question. Maybe ritual and belief evolved together, each reinforcing the other, locked in a feedback loop that transformed scattered bands of paranoid primates into people who could imagine the eternal and mobilize thousands to honor it. You gather to dance, and the synchrony feels meaningful. You interpret that meaning as a presence, a spirit, a god. The presence demands ritual. The ritual reinforces the presence. Round and round, generation after generation, until you can't separate the belief from the behavior anymore. They're one system now, woven so tightly that asking which came first is like asking which came first, the chicken or the egg. You're lying in an fMRI machine, trying not to move, while a neuroscientist asks you to pray. The machine is loud, that rhythmic knocking like a mechanical heart, and you're supposed to achieve transcendence while your head is locked in place and researchers monitor every millimeter of blood flow through your brain. This is neurotheology, and it's as weird as it sounds. The field asks a simple question with complicated implications. What happens in your brain when you feel the presence of God? Let's get the disappointing news out of the way first. There is no God spot in your brain. No single region that lights up exclusively during prayer or meditation. No neural switch you can flip to instant enlightenment. The idea of a dedicated God module is, scientifically speaking, dead. Andrew Newberg, the researcher who has spent decades scanning monks and nuns and Sufi mystics, is absolutely clear about this. Religious and spiritual experiences are typically highly complex, involving emotions, thoughts, sensations, and behaviors. These experiences seem far too rich and diverse to derive solely from one part of the brain. Religious experience, it turns out, is a whole brain affair, a coordinated symphony involving multiple regions working in concert. But just because there's no single God spot doesn't mean neuroscience has nothing interesting to say about faith. When Newberg scanned the brains of Tibetan Buddhist monks deep in meditation, he found something fascinating: increased blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, the area involved in focused attention and willpower. Make sense? Meditation is essentially attention training, but simultaneously he found decreased activity in the superior posterior parietal lobe, the region that normally gives you your sense of spatial orientation and the boundary between self and other. When that area quiets down, you lose the sense of where you end and the world begins. You feel boundless, connected to everything, merged with the universe. Every mystical tradition describes this experience: ego death, cosmic unity, oneness with the divine. Turns out, it has a neural signature. Newberg ran similar scans on Franciscan nuns during intense prayer. Different tradition, different theology, different practices, but the brain patterns looked remarkably similar. Increased frontal lobe activity during focused contemplation. Decreased parietal lobe activity during moments of union with God. Whether you're chanting Om Mani Padme Hum or reciting the rosary, your brain responds in recognizable ways. That doesn't mean both practices are accessing the same ultimate reality, and it doesn't mean they're just making it up. It means the hardware for spiritual experience is universal, even if the software, the specific beliefs and practices, varies by culture. Here's where it gets philosophically tricky. Finding a neural correlate of religious experience doesn't prove or disprove God any more than finding a neural correlate of vision proves or disproves the existence of light. When you look at a tree, your visual cortex activates. That doesn't mean the tree isn't real. It means your brain is successfully processing information about reality. So when you pray and your brain activates in specific ways, maybe your brain is successfully processing information about a spiritual reality. Or maybe it's generating the entire experience internally. The brain scan can't tell you which. Historians still argue whether these brain imaging studies reveal anything fundamental about religion or just confirm what mystics have known for millennia: focused attention and surrender of ego produce altered states. Medieval Christian contemplatives wrote detailed guides to achieving mystical union. Hindu yogis mapped the stages of consciousness centuries ago. Buddhist meditation teachers have phenomenological maps of enlightenment states that rival anything neuroscience has produced. All neurotheology does is translate that wisdom into the language of blood flow and neurotransmitters. Let's talk about the temporal lobes, because they have a special place in the history of God and the brain. Back in 1963, researchers Slater and Beard noticed something odd. 38% of patients with temporal lobe epilepsy reported intense religious or mystical experiences during seizures, visions of angels, conversations with God, overwhelming feelings of cosmic significance. The hypothesis emerged that the temporal lobes, when stimulated either by epilepsy or meditation or prayer, might be key players in spiritual experience. Canadian neuroscientist Michael Persinger took this idea and ran with it straight off a cliff, according to his critics. He built the God helmet, a modified motorcycle helmet that applied weak magnetic fields to the temporal lobes. Persinger claimed 80% of subjects reported sensing a presence, feeling spiritual awe, encountering something transcendent. Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist biologist, volunteered to try it for a BBC documentary in 2005. The result? Nothing. Dawkins reported feeling pleasantly relaxed, but experienced zero spiritual revelation. He was disappointed. So were the researchers hoping to reduce God to magnetism? When Swedish scientists at Uppsala University tried to replicate Persinger's findings in a proper double-blind study, the whole thing fell apart. Subjects' reported experiences were predicted entirely by their personality traits and suggestibility, not by whether the magnetic fields were actually turned on. The God helmet, it turns out, was mostly placebo. The magnetic fields Persinger used were about 1 million times weaker than the transcranial magnetic stimulation that actually affects neurons. It was, as one neurologist put it, like trying to knock down a building by blowing on it. Here's a quirky detail you probably don't know. Some historical religious figures may have been experiencing temporal lobe epilepsy. St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, blinding light, hearing voices, temporary blindness matches the symptoms. Joan of Arc's visions started in childhood and included sensory hallucinations. Dostoevsky, who wrote extensively about his religious experiences, had epilepsy and described ecstatic seizure auras that felt more meaningful than anything else in his life. Does that mean their experiences were just epilepsy? Or does it mean epilepsy gave them access to something real? Depends on your prior metaphysical commitments. You're back in that fMRI machine now, and the scan is complete. The researcher shows you the images, colorful blobs overlaid on gray brain tissue, showing which regions were active during prayer. Your frontal lobes lit up. Your parietal lobes dimmed. You saw the same patterns as the Tibetan monks, the Franciscan nuns, the Sufi mystics. You're part of the data set now, another data point in humanity's attempt to reverse engineer transcendence. But something bothers you about the whole enterprise. Reducing the experience to blood flow feels like explaining music by analyzing the vibrations in a piano string. Technically accurate, completely missing the point. When you prayed, you felt something. Whether that something came from inside your brain or from outside the universe, the scan can't tell you. It just tells you that when humans reach toward the infinite, certain biological patterns emerge. We're built to sense the sacred, whether the sacred is real or imagined. You're walking alone through a forest at dusk. The light is failing, shadows are lengthening, and you hear a stick snap somewhere behind you. You freeze. Your heart rate spikes. Every sense sharpens. You turn around slowly, scanning the darkening trees. Nothing. Just wind-moving branches, probably. Probably. You walk faster anyway, and you don't look back again until you're safely home. That response. That instant, involuntary leap from noise to threat just saved your ancestors' lives for 2 million years. It's called hyperactive agency detection, and it's the reason you believe in ghosts. Here's how it works. Your brain is fundamentally a prediction machine, constantly generating hypotheses about what's happening around you. When ambiguous information arrives, a rustling sound, a shadow moving in peripheral vision, a door you're sure you closed now standing open, your brain has to make a split-second decision. Is that an agent, something with intention and possibly hostile goals? Or is it just environmental noise, wind, and settling wood, and your imagination? The evolutionarily smart bet is to assume agency. If you're wrong, you've wasted a little adrenaline and look paranoid. If you're right, you don't get eaten. Your ancestors who assumed every ambiguous stimulus might be a predator survived long enough to become your ancestors. The ones who shrugged it off became someone else's dinner. Psychologist Justin Barrett coined the term HADDD, the hyperactive agency detection device, to describe this cognitive bias. Think of it as your brain's smoke detector, deliberately oversensitive because false alarms are annoying but missing a real fire is fatal, Barrett explains. Part of the reason people believe in gods, ghosts, and goblins comes from the way in which our minds, particularly our agency detection device, functions. Our ADD suffers from some hyperactivity, making it prone to find agents around us, including supernatural ones, given fairly. Modest evidence of their presence. Let's do a thought experiment. You're a hunter-gatherer on the African savanna 70,000 years ago. You hear a rustling in the tall grass. Option 1. You assume it's the wind and keep digging for roots. Option 2. You assume it's a lion and run. Now, run the scenarios. If it was wind and you ran, you've wasted energy and your tribe teases you. Embarrassing, but survivable. If it was a lion and you ignored it, you die screaming. Not survivable. Over thousands of generations, natural selection ruthlessly filtered out the calm, rational people who required solid evidence before panicking. What survived were the nervous, jumpy people who saw predators everywhere. You're descended from the paranoid ones, and you inherited their overactive threat detection systems. Historians still argue whether this hyperactivity really explains the origin of supernatural belief, or if we're collapsing too many complex phenomena into one mechanism. After all, detecting predators is different from worshipping gods. A lion is a real agent with real intentions. A spirit allegedly controlling the weather is something else entirely. But the basic insight holds. Once your brain is primed to detect agency promiscuously, it detects agency everywhere, including places where no biological agent exists. Stuart Guthrie, anthropologist at Fordham University, spent his career studying anthropomorphism, the tendency to attribute human-like qualities to non-human things. His book, Faces in the Clouds, published in '93, argues that religion is essentially systematic anthropomorphism, the strategy of guessing agent first when uncertain, evolved because other humans and animals are the most important things in our environment. When you don't understand why it's raining, or why your child got sick, or why the crops failed, your brain defaults to the same explanation it uses for everything else. Someone with intentions caused this. Thunder becomes the anger of sky gods. Disease becomes punishment for sin. Luck becomes the favor of spirits. It's anthropomorphism all the way down. Here's a quirky fact researchers discovered in labs you can manipulate agency detection by manipulating fear. Show people ambiguous images, random visual noise, flickering shadows, unclear shapes, and ask what they see. When people are comfortable and feel in control, they report seeing abstract patterns. When you make people anxious first, maybe by having them read scary stories or sit in an unstable chair, they suddenly start seeing faces in the noise, intentional patterns where there are none. When you feel vulnerable, your brain conjures agents. Religion, by this logic, spikes during times of uncertainty because uncertain times demand explanations, and brains prefer agentive explanations to random chance. You're walking through that forest again, but this time you know the mechanism. You hear the stick snap and you think, that's just my HAD misfiring, my overactive agency detection creating false positives. But you still walk faster, you still glance over your shoulder. Because the mechanism is older than your cortex, deeper than rational thought, and it doesn't care what you consciously believe. It cares about keeping you alive, and to keep you alive, it will make you see threats that aren't there 99 times if it means you'll see the one real threat on the 100th. Now scale this up to entire cultures. Everyone in your tribe has the same hyperactive agency detector. Everyone experiences ambiguous events, storms, disease, death, unexplained sounds in the night. And everyone's brain generates the same category of explanation, agents, unseen beings with intentions. Share those explanations, ritualize them, pass them down through stories, and you've got the foundations of religion. You've got spirits in trees and ancestors watching from beyond. You've got gods controlling thunder and demons causing misfortune. You've got a universe populated by invisible agents because your brain cannot help but populate the universe with agents. That's what it was built to do. But here's where it gets philosophically interesting. Just because HADD produces false positives doesn't mean it never produces true positives. If invisible agents actually exist, gods, spirits, whatever, then a hyperactive detection system would be better at finding them than a skeptical one. Maybe religious people aren't deluded. Maybe they're just optimizing for a different error rate. Maybe atheists are reducing false positives at the cost of missing true signals. Or maybe, as the atheists would argue, there are no true signals, and religious people are just really good at seeing patterns in static. Theory of mind. The ability to attribute mental states to others plays into this too. Humans are exceptional at mind reading. By age 4, children understand that other people have beliefs, desires, intentions different from their own. This is crucial for social cooperation, but it has an interesting side effect. Once you've got a mind reading module, you can apply it to anything. Trees don't have minds, but you can project intention onto them anyway. The ocean doesn't have desires, but you can imagine it as angry or generous. Clouds don't have beliefs, but you can see faces in them and wonder what they're thinking. HAD plus theory of mind equals a brain that cannot stop generating invisible agents. Deborah Kellerman at Boston University studies what she calls promiscuous teleology, the tendency to see purpose and design everywhere. Show young children a pointy rock and ask why it's pointy. Adults say, erosion, natural processes, random chance. Young children say, so animals can scratch themselves. Kellerman argues children are intuitive theists, naturally inclined to see the world as designed for purposes. Pointy rocks exist for scratching. Clouds exist for raining. Mountains exist for climbing. Everything has a function. Therefore, everything was designed. Therefore, there must be a designer. It's not taught. It's how children naturally think before education overrides it. You're alone in your house at night, and you hear footsteps upstairs. You know you're alone. You locked all the doors, but your brain whispers, someone is there. That's HAD. That's 2 million years of evolution overruling your conscious knowledge because conscious knowledge is a recent innovation and survival instincts are ancient. And if you extrapolate that feeling across a lifetime, across a culture, across the entirety of human history, you get religion. You get gods born from the same neural circuits that keep you alert in dark forests, the same hypervigilance that saved your ancestors from predators, now repurposed to populate the world with demons and angels, with watchers and judges, with unseen powers that care deeply about your behavior. You see a face in your bathroom tiles, not a vague suggestion, an actual face, eyes and nose and mouth, staring at you from the ceramic patterns while you brush your teeth. You blink. It's still there. You know intellectually that it's just random grout lines and color variations, but your brain has locked onto the pattern, and now you can't unsee it. This is pareidolia, a specific subtype of agency detection, and it reveals something profound about how your brain processes reality. You don't see what's there, you see what your brain predicts should be there, and your brain really expects faces. The phenomenon is universal and ancient. Leonardo da Vinci wrote about it in the 1500s, advising artists to study stained walls and clouds because you will be able to see various battles and figures in action, strange-looking faces and costumes. He understood intuitively what neuroscience has since confirmed. Human visual processing is optimized for pattern recognition, especially social patterns, especially faces. The fusiform face area, a region on the underside of your temporal lobe, activates so readily to face-like stimuli that it fires even for random arrangements of dots in a triangular configuration. 2 dots above, 1 below instant face detection, even though you consciously know it's not a face. Stuart Guthrie built an entire theory of religion on this insight. His book, Faces in the Clouds, published by Oxford University Press in 1993, argues that religious belief emerges from our tendency to anthropomorphize everything. We see human-like agency in clouds and wind and thunder because detecting other humans and animals was the most important survival skill our ancestors had. The strategy of guessing agent first when uncertain evolved because other humans and animals are the most important things in our environment, Guthrie explains. Better to mistake a boulder for a bear than mistake a bear for a boulder. The cost of over-attribution is minimal. The cost of under-attribution is death. Researchers have tested this experimentally. Show people pure white noise, random static with absolutely zero patterns, and about 30 to 40% will report seeing faces. The percentage goes up when you make people anxious first. Anxiety increases false face detection because anxiety signals danger, and danger means you need to find the threats quickly, even if you have to invent them. Your brain would rather see 10 faces that aren't there than miss one face. That is, because missing a face might mean missing a predator, or an enemy, or an opportunity for alliance. The evolutionary math is simple. False positives are cheap, false negatives are deadly. Now apply this to religion. You don't see a face in clouds, you see a god in the sky. You don't hear wind through trees, you hear spirits whispering. Thunder isn't atmospheric electricity discharging, it's an angry deity expressing displeasure. Every natural phenomenon becomes saturated with intention because your brain is fundamentally unable to perceive the world as meaningless. Meaninglessness is unnatural to human cognition. Agency is natural. So when you can't understand why something happened, why the drought came, why the child died, why you recovered from illness, your brain generates an agentive explanation automatically before conscious reflection even has time to kick in. Historians still argue whether Guthrie's anthropomorphism thesis fully explains religious complexity. After all, seeing a face in toast is different from building theological systems with moral codes and metaphysical claims about the nature of reality. But Guthrie's defenders point out that you have to start somewhere. Before you have elaborate theology, you have to have the basic intuition that the world is populated by agents, seen and unseen, who respond to human actions. That intuition is rooted in pareidolia, in our compulsive pattern seeking, in the fact that human brains are prediction machines that prefer false patterns to no pattern at all. Here's a detail that sounds made up but is well documented. People report seeing Jesus, Mary, or other religious figures in stains, burn marks, and food items with startling regularity. Jesus on toast, Mary in a window reflection, the face of Christ in a Cheeto. These stories make the news because they're absurd, but they're absurd precisely because they're common. Google Jesus in toast, and you'll find hundreds of examples. What you're seeing is pareidolia plus expectation. If you're primed to think about religious figures and your brain detects any face-like pattern, it fills in the blanks with what you expect. Someone culturally primed for Buddha would see Buddha. Someone primed for Elvis would see Elvis. The mechanism is the same, only the content changes. Paul Bloom, psychologist at Yale, argues that humans are intuitive dualists. We naturally think of the world as containing both physical stuff and non-physical minds. Children as young as 3 distinguish between brain functions and mental experiences. Show a child the brain and ask if it does math, they'll say yes. Ask if the brain feels sad or loves its mother, they'll say no. Those mental activities feel like something separate from the physical organ. This intuitive dualism makes belief in souls, ghosts, and gods psychologically effortless. If minds can exist independently of bodies in your intuitive model of reality, then invisible minds become not just possible, but expected. Jesse Baring, experimental psychologist now at the University of Otago, demonstrated this with a puppet show. He showed children a puppet mouse getting eaten by a puppet alligator. Then he asked, now that the mouse is dead, does it still need to eat? Does it still have a brain? Is it still hungry? Does it still love its mother? Young children get the biological stuff right. The dead mouse doesn't need to eat, doesn't have a working brain, but they attribute continuing mental states. The dead mouse still loves its mother, still feels things. Baring's interpretation, we literally cannot imagine what it's like to be dead, so we project continuity of consciousness even when we know biological function has ceased. This cognitive architecture makes afterlife beliefs almost inevitable. You're walking past a cemetery at night now, and you feel watched. Rationally, you know corpses can't see. But that feeling persists, that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of presence. Your brain is doing what it does best, detecting agency, finding patterns, refusing to accept the universe of meaningless matter in motion. Every gravestone becomes a potential watcher. Every shadow could be a spirit. You walk faster, and you don't feel silly about it, because 2 million years of evolution is stronger than 300 years of scientific materialism. The mechanism extends beyond faces. Rhythmic sounds can seem intentional. Wind howling through a canyon sounds like voices if you're already primed to expect voices. Random events cluster in ways that look patterned if you're looking for patterns. Coincidences feel meaningful because your brain assigns meaning reflexively, without asking permission from your skeptical frontal cortex. You pray for something and it happens a week later. Causation or coincidence? Your pattern-seeking brain votes causation every time, because that's what pattern-seeking brains do. They seek patterns, find them whether they're there or not, and then act as if the patterns are real. Michael Shermer, founder of Skeptic magazine, calls this patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in meaningless noise. It's a feature, not a bug. In a world where missing real patterns gets you killed, it's safer to see too many patterns than too few. So we see constellations in random star arrangements, faces in clouds, intention in chance, and gods in thunder. We populate the world with invisible watchers because we're built to detect watchers, and when we don't find visible ones, we invent invisible alternatives. You inherit your mother's eyes, your father's sense of humor, and apparently, according to geneticist Dean Hamer, your capacity for spiritual transcendence. In 2004, Hamer published a book called The God Gene: How Faith is Hardwired into Our Genes, claiming he'd found a specific genetic variant, a particular version of the VMAT2 gene, that made some people naturally more spiritual than others. The media loved it. The headlines wrote themselves. God encoded in DNA, faith reduced to base pairs, belief explained by biochemistry. There was only one problem. The science was catastrophically oversold. Here's what Hamer actually found. He analyzed DNA samples from over 1,000 people who had filled out personality questionnaires, specifically looking at scores on something called self-transcendence, a vague psychological construct that measures whether you feel connected to the universe, believe in ESP, support environmental causes, or generally experience what the test designers called mystical feelings. Hamer found that people with certain variants of VMAT2 scored slightly higher on self-transcendence. The effect was statistically detectable, but tiny. VMAT2 accounted for less than 1% of the variance in self-transcendence scores. Less than 1%. Hamer himself acknowledged that most of the inherited effects on self-transcendence can't be explained by VMAT2. He estimated there might be 50 or more genes of similar effect contributing to spirituality. But here's the real problem. The study was never peer-reviewed, never published in a scientific journal, never subjected to the scrutiny that actual science requires. It went straight to book form, bypassing the entire apparatus designed to catch methodological errors and overstated claims. No replication has ever confirmed Hamer's findings. The God gene exists only in popular culture, not in scientific literature. It's a catchy headline attached to weak data. Science journalist Carl Zimmer eviscerated the concept in a review, suggesting the book should have been titled, A Gene That Accounts for Less Than 1% of the Variance. Found in scores on psychological questionnaires designed to measure a factor called self-transcendence, which can signify everything from belonging to the Green Party to believing in ESP, according to one unpublished, unreplicated study. Zimmer's sarcasm highlights the central problem. VMAT2 isn't a God gene. It's a gene that codes for a protein pump, a vesicular monoamine transporter that packages neurotransmitters for release during brain activity. One thing it definitely isn't is a biological switch for religious belief. Biologist P.Z. Myers was even blunter. It's a pump. A teeny tiny pump responsible for packaging a neurotransmitter for export during brain activity. Calling it the God gene is like calling your heart the love organ because it beats faster when you see your crush. Technically, the heart is involved in the physiological response to attraction, but nobody seriously thinks love is reducible to cardiovascular activity. Same with VMAT2 and spirituality. Historians still argue whether the God gene debacle set back or advanced public understanding of behavioral genetics. On one hand, it generated interest in the genetic basis of psychological traits. On the other hand, it reinforced the worst kind of genetic determinism. The idea that complex behaviors can be reduced to single genes with simple effects. That's not how genes work. That's not how behavior works. And conflating the two misleads people about both genetics and spirituality. But here's the thing, even though Hamer's specific claim failed, the broader question he was asking is legitimate. Is there a genetic component to religiosity? And the answer, surprisingly, is yes. Not from Hamer's unpublished VMAT2 study, but from decades of rigorous twin research that Hamer largely ignored. The Minnesota study of twins reared apart, led by psychologist Thomas Bouchard, is one of the most valuable datasets in behavioral genetics. Researchers identified pairs of identical twins who were separated at birth and raised in completely different environments, different families, different religions, different cultures, different countries sometimes. These separated twins are a natural experiment. They share 100% of their DNA, but 0% of their environments. If identical twins reared apart are more similar to each other than you'd expect by chance, that similarity must be genetic. And they are similar. Strikingly similar. Not just in physical appearance. Everyone expects that. But in personality traits, career preferences, hobbies, phobias, and, yes, religiosity. Bouchard found that about 50% of the variance in adult religiosity appears to be heritable. That doesn't mean there's a religion gene. It means that whatever genetic factors influence personality, temperament, openness to experience, and emotional reactivity also influence whether you're drawn to religious belief and practice. It's polygenic, influenced by many genes of small effect, and it's mediated by psychology, culture, and experience. But it's real. Here's a quirky detail from twin studies that most people find surprising. The heritability of religiosity changes across your lifespan. In childhood and adolescence, your religious beliefs are almost entirely determined by your environment, specifically, your parents. Kids believe what their parents teach them. Heritability for religiosity in children is close to zero, but as you age into adulthood, especially after leaving your parents' home, genetic influences start emerging. By your 30s and 40s, about 40 to 50% of the variance in religiosity is heritable. You inherit your parents' religion as a child, but in adulthood, your genes influence whether you stay religious, switch religions, or abandon faith altogether. Kenneth Kendler's research at Virginia Commonwealth University confirmed this pattern across thousands of twin pairs. Shared environment dominates religious belief in youth. Genetic factors dominate in adulthood. The interpretation, in childhood, you don't have much choice about religion. You go to your parents' church, mosque, temple, or stay home on Sundays based on their decisions. But in adulthood, when you're free to choose, your innate temperament, which is substantially heritable, influences whether religious belief and practice feel natural and meaningful or forced and empty. Danish twin research from 2013 found something even more specific. Personal religiousness, stuff like private prayer and belief in God, was more influenced by genetics than social forms of religion, like church attendance. The implication, going through the motions of religion, is largely cultural and learned, but the inner experience of faith has a significant biological component. Some brains are built to find spiritual practice fulfilling. Others aren't. Now, why would natural selection favor genes that predispose people to spirituality? Several evolutionary theories compete. One hypothesis: religious people form tighter-knit communities, cooperate more effectively, and support each other during crises, leading to better survival and reproduction rates. Richard Sosis studied 19th century communes and found that religious communes, demanding costly sacrifices, outlasted secular communes with similar requirements. Religion, In this view is social glue that binds groups together, and genetic predispositions toward religiosity get passed down because religious groups outcompete less cohesive groups. Another hypothesis: religion provides psychological buffers against stress, anxiety, and depression, which translates to health benefits and longer lifespans. Extensive research shows religious people have lower rates of substance abuse, better cardiovascular health, and reduced all-cause mortality. If belief in a protective deity reduces chronic stress, and chronic stress kills, then genes predisposing toward belief would be selected for. A third hypothesis: religious commitment signals trustworthiness to other group members, making you a more attractive cooperation partner. If you believe an omniscient God watches your every action and punishes dishonesty, you're statistically more likely to be honest in situations where human monitoring is impossible. People who believe in divine surveillance are better cooperators, get trusted more, get included in more opportunities, and pass down their genes at higher rates. You're looking at your own hands now, thinking about the double helix coiled inside every cell, wondering what predispositions you inherited. Maybe you grew up religious and it felt natural, an easy fit, something you never questioned. Or maybe you grew up religious and it felt like wearing someone else's clothes, never quite right, something you eventually had to shed. That difference between whom religion fits and whom it doesn't might not be entirely about arguments and evidence. It might be partly about neurotransmitter receptor densities, serotonin signaling pathways, dopamine system variations, tiny molecular differences that add up to vast experiential differences. You're sitting in a psychology lab, and a graduate student hands you a questionnaire. 2 questions, seemingly innocuous. Please briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your own death arouses in you, and jot down, as specifically as you can, what you think will happen to you physically when you die and once you are physically dead. You write for a few minutes, imagining decay and non-existence, your body returning to elements, consciousness winking out like a candle. Then the questionnaire shifts to something unrelated: your opinions on certain political issues, your attitudes toward people from different countries. You don't notice the connection, but the researchers do. You've just been mortality salience primed, and your worldview defenses are about to spike. This is the standard experimental paradigm of terror management theory, and it's been replicated over 200 times in more than 30 countries. The basic finding is both simple and disturbing. Reminding people of death makes them more defensive about their cultural beliefs, more hostile to outsiders, and more desperate to prove their value according to the standards of their worldview. And here's the part that connects to religion. For most people, that worldview includes some answer to what happens after death, and those answers are what keep existential terror at bay. Ernest Becker, who died of cancer at age 49 in 1974, won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Denial of Death. Becker's central argument is that humans face a unique psychological bind. We have biological instincts for self-preservation like any animal, but we also have sophisticated cognitive abilities that make us aware death is inevitable. We know we're going to die. We can anticipate it, fear it, obsess over it. And that knowledge, Becker argued, creates the terror of absolute annihilation, an existential anxiety so overwhelming that our entire psychological architecture is organized around denying it. Becker's memorable phrase captures the human predicament. We are gods with anuses. We have cosmic aspirations, dreams of significance and permanence, desires to matter eternally. But we're trapped in animal bodies that shit and decay and die. Character itself, Becker claimed, forms around managing this contradiction. We create immortality projects, careers, families, creative works, political movements that give us a sense of transcending death. And religion, in this framework, is the ultimate immortality project because it promises actual continuation of consciousness beyond bodily death. 3 social psychologists, Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pisakinski, spent the 1980s turning Becker's philosophical insights into testable hypotheses. They developed terror management theory, arguing that humans manage death anxiety through 3 interconnected systems: cultural worldviews that provide meaning and promise immortality, self-esteem derived from living up to those worldviews, and close relationships that validate our significance. Religion offers all 3 simultaneously: a story about what happens after death, standards for achieving value through moral behavior, and a community of fellow believers who affirm your worth. The experiments are elegant in their simplicity. Control group gets neutral questions. Please describe your feelings about watching television, and what do you think happens when you watch television? Experimental group gets the death questions. Then, both groups complete tasks measuring worldview defense, self-esteem striving, or relationship bonding. The consistent finding, mortality salience, increases all three. After thinking about death, Christians rate fellow Christians more positively and Muslims more negatively. Americans defend pro-American essays more vigorously. People become more generous to their in-group and more hostile to out-groups. They become more interested in romantic partners who boost their self-esteem and less interested in casual sex that doesn't. Historians still argue whether these effects are robust or represent publication bias and p-hacking. A massive 2017 replication attempt called Many Labs 4 involved 21 labs and over 2,000 participants, and it failed to reproduce the classic mortality salience effect on worldview defense. Subsequent meta-analyses suggest the effect may be much smaller than original studies reported, and some researchers estimate only 19 to 25% replicability. The terror management theory founders dispute these critiques, pointing to methodological differences, but the replication crisis has clearly impacted TMT's credibility. But here's what makes TMT particularly relevant to religion. Mortality salience doesn't just strengthen pre-existing beliefs. It can create belief where it didn't exist. A 2012 study by Jong, Halberstadt, and Blumke found that after death reminders, even self-identified atheists showed increased implicit supernatural belief at unconscious levels. The researchers used a test called the implicit association test, which measures reaction times when pairing concepts. After mortality salience, atheists were faster at associating supernatural with real and slower at associating supernatural with not real. Their conscious beliefs didn't change. They still identified as atheists, but their unconscious intuitions shifted toward belief. The interpretation, belief in continuation after death, is so psychologically useful for managing terror that your brain defaults to it automatically when threatened with mortality, regardless of your explicit philosophical commitments. You can consciously reject the afterlife, but when death becomes salient, some ancient part of your brain starts whispering, maybe consciousness continues, maybe death isn't final, maybe there's something more. It's a defense mechanism, potentially hardwired or at least deeply learned. Here's a quirky detail from cross-cultural studies. Mortality salience effects vary by culture. Asian samples show smaller effects than American samples, possibly because collectivist cultures provide alternative buffers against death anxiety. If your identity is more group-based than individual-based, then the group's continuation after your personal death might provide sufficient immortality. You don't need heaven if your legacy lives through your descendants and community. But even in collectivist cultures, religious belief spikes after mortality salience, just less dramatically than in individualist Western societies. Brain imaging studies show specific neural correlates of death awareness. fMRI scans reveal that when people encounter mortality-related stimuli, the right amygdala activates. That's your fear processing center. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in conflict monitoring and emotional regulation, also engages. And crucially, people with low self-esteem show stronger neural reactions to death-related words than people with high self-esteem. Self-worth literally buffers against existential terror at the level of neurons firing. You're lying in bed now, 3 a.m., and you can't sleep because you're thinking about not existing. Not sleeping, not dreaming, not anything. Just the absence of experience, stretching forward forever. Your brain recoils. It can't model non-existence because consciousness is the only thing your brain has ever known. Jesse Baring's research shows we literally cannot imagine our own non-existence. Try it. Try to genuinely imagine what it's like to be dead, not from an outside perspective, but from the inside. You can't. Your brain keeps inserting a perspective, a witness, an I that's observing the absence. And that inability to simulate non-existence creates the persistent intuition that maybe consciousness doesn't end, maybe there's continuity, maybe death is a transition rather than termination. Religion, from a terror management perspective, is humanity's collective answer to the terror. Every major religion offers some form of continuation. Heaven, reincarnation, merging with Brahman, joining the ancestors, living in God's memory. Even religions without clear afterlives, like some forms of Judaism, offer symbolic immortality through contributing to the eternal covenant, being remembered in your community, living on through your descendants. The specific details vary, but the function is universal. Transform death from absolute ending into transition, passage, transformation into something else. You're an atheist. Let's say you're confident about it. No hedging, no agnosticism, just straightforward disbelief in gods, spirits, souls, or anything supernatural. You've rejected organized religion, read Dawkins and Hitchens, understand evolutionary biology and cognitive biases. You're a rationalist, an empiricist, a materialist, and you're about to discover that you still have faith, just not in God. The mechanism of faith, it turns out, is distinct from the content of faith. You can reject every religious claim ever made and still deploy the same cognitive architecture that makes religion possible. Because faith, at its core, isn't about gods. It's about believing in things you can't verify through direct experience, coordinating that belief with others, and organizing your life around shared commitments to ideas that exist only because we collectively agree they exist. Yuval Noah Harari, historian and author of *Sapiens*, calls these intersubjective realities, fictions that exist in the space between minds rather than in the physical world or in any individual's imagination. Money is Harari's paradigmatic example. A $100 bill is just paper. It has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it, can't build with it, can't use it as a weapon. But we collectively agree it's worth something, and that collective agreement makes it valuable. The moment everyone stops believing in money, it becomes worthless paper. Money is a shared myth, sustained entirely by faith. Nations are the same. Borders don't exist in nature. There's no observable property that makes one side of a river, United States, and the other side, Canada, except for human agreement. You could run every scientific test imaginable on soil samples from both sides and find no national differences because nations are imaginary. They're powerful, consequential, real in their effects, but they're not materially real. They're intersubjective. Harari's point. Nations do not exist in any observable way. No experiment will detect them, but yet they have great power. That power comes from collective faith. Corporations are even more obviously fictional, Harari notes. You could kill every employee and stakeholder in Peugeot, but the corporate entity would still exist. Peugeot isn't its workers or its factories or its cars. It's a legal fiction, a narrative we maintain because it's useful for organizing economic activity, limited liability, stock ownership, corporate personhood. All of these are intersubjective realities that exist only in our shared imagination, but have massive real-world consequences. Human rights fall into the same category. There's nothing scientifically special about any individual Homo sapiens that inscribes rights onto their biology. Rights aren't physical properties you can measure. They're declarations we agree to uphold, norms we collectively enforce, stories we tell about human dignity and worth, and those stories only work if enough people believe them. If tomorrow everyone stopped believing in human rights, they would cease to exist. Not as biological facts, because they never were biological facts, but as functional social realities. Historians still argue whether calling these things myths or fictions is appropriate, or if it misleadingly suggests they're less important than physical reality. Defenders of the concept point out that intersubjective realities are arguably more important than most physical realities. The rock outside your house is real in a material sense, but it probably doesn't affect your life much. The money in your bank account, the legal status of your citizenship, the intellectual property rights protecting your work. These fictions shape your existence far more profoundly than most tangible objects. And here's the key insight. Maintaining these fictions requires exactly the kind of belief that characterizes religious faith. You have faith in money even though you've never met the people guaranteeing it. You have faith in laws even though you can't observe their existence. You have faith that contracts will be enforced, that promises will be kept, that the social order will persist through tomorrow. None of this is empirically verifiable in the moment. It's all trust extended into the future based on past patterns and collective agreement. Philip Tetlock's research on sacred values reveals that secular ideologies function identically to religious ones at the psychological level. A sacred value, in Tetlock's framework, is any value that a moral community treats as possessing infinite or transcendental significance that precludes comparisons, trade-offs, or indeed any other mingling with bounded or secular values. Ask someone to trade a sacred value for money, a taboo trade-off, and they exhibit moral outrage, anger, disgust, and increasing inflexibility. Offers of money make them less willing to compromise, not more, the backfire effect. This applies to secular values as readily as religious ones. Environmentalists treat nature as sacred. Libertarians treat individual liberty as sacred. Humanists treat equality and dignity as sacred. These aren't gods, but they function like gods psychologically, as absolute commitments that cannot be traded away, as sources of meaning that justify sacrifice, as frameworks that give life purpose. You can be an atheist and still have a sacred value system. You just sacralize different things. Research on non-believers shows they endorse a variety of beliefs and worldviews, such as rationalistic and humanistic ideologies that may serve compensatory functions. Science can, at least in part, compensate for religion and serve an analogous psychological function. The key word is compensatory. Non-believers aren't simply lacking something believers have. They're filling the same psychological needs through alternative means. Here's a detail that surprises people. Atheists process mortality. Salients similarly to believers. They just activate different buffers. When reminded of death, atheists don't turn to God, but they do turn to their worldview. They defend science more vigorously. They assert the meaningfulness of legacy and impact. They emphasize human connection and earthly achievements. The terror management mechanism is the same, only the content differs. Everyone needs an answer to mortality. Atheists answer with naturalism, humanism, and the comfort of contributing to human knowledge or well-being. It's still a faith-based claim. You have faith that your contributions matter, that meaning can exist without cosmic validation, that life is worth living despite its finitude. A 2025 study published in PNAS tested nearly 4,000 people across 8 of the world's most secular countries: Canada, China, Czech Republic, Japan, Netherlands, Sweden, UK, and Vietnam. The researchers found something startling. Even atheists, in relatively secular societies, intuitively prefer religious belief to atheism. When presented with scenarios where events led to either more atheists or more believers, people's odds of rating the religious outcome as intentionally caused were about 40% higher when the outcome created atheists. Something about atheism registers as a problem to be explained, even for explicit non-believers. Lead researcher Will Gervais concludes, because religions have exerted tremendous influence on our societies for millennia, it would be genuinely surprising if some latent religious trace didn't culturally linger as overt expressions of faith decline. The implication, atheism might be possible, but it's not natural. It requires actively overriding cognitive defaults, resisting intuitive explanations, building alternative meaning systems that go against the grain of how brains naturally operate. You're looking at a dollar bill now, really examining it. In God we trust, it says. But the real miracle isn't the God reference, it's that this piece of paper works at all. That you can exchange it for food, shelter, services, goods. That everyone agrees on its value despite its material worthlessness. That collective faith, sustained across millions of people who will never meet, makes an economy possible. You've been practicing faith your whole life. In currencies and contracts and constitutions, in the idea that tomorrow will resemble today, that other people will honor their commitments, that the social world will remain stable enough to make plans. Religion didn't invent faith. It channeled a capacity that was already there, a capacity for organizing around shared beliefs that transcend individual verification. Atheists use that same capacity. They just aim it at different objects: science, progress, human rights, the arc of history, bending toward justice. These are articles of faith masquerading as obvious truths, sustained not by evidence, because how would you empirically prove that progress is real or justice is meaningful, but by collective commitment to treating them as real? The mechanism of faith, it seems, is unavoidable. You can change what you believe in, but you can't escape believing. You're standing in the ruins of an ancient city, let's say in Mesopotamia, somewhere around 3000 BCE. It's hot, dusty, and crowded. Thousands of people live here, farming irrigated fields, trading goods in markets, building mud brick ziggurats to honor gods you've never met. Most people here are strangers. You don't know their families, haven't shared meals with them, can't track their reputations through personal experience. And yet, somehow this works. Somehow, thousands of anonymous individuals cooperate in building canals, storing grain for future droughts, defending walls against raiders. How? The old answer was agriculture and surplus. The new answer is more interesting: big gods. Ara Norenzayan, psychologist at the University of British Columbia, published a book in 2013 called Big Gods: How Religion Transformed Cooperation and Conflict. His thesis is elegantly simple. Large-scale human cooperation became possible only when people invented moralizing, omniscient deities who watched everyone's behavior and punished transgressions. Before big gods, you have small gods, spirits and ancestors who might want appeasing but don't particularly care if you cheat your neighbor. Small gods work fine for small groups where everyone knows everyone and reputation tracking is automatic. But small gods don't scale. Big gods scale because they're supernatural surveillance systems. God sees you when you're sleeping, knows when you're awake, knows if you've been bad or good, and that's not just a Christmas song, it's a description of the cognitive transformation that made civilization possible. When you believe an omniscient being monitors your every action, you behave prosocially even when no human is watching. You don't steal from the communal grain storage because God will know. You don't cheat in trades because divine punishment awaits. You cooperate with strangers because you're all under the same cosmic surveillance. Norenzayan traces the evolution of gods from indifferent nature spirits to moralizing cosmic judges. Early religions feature gods who are powerful but not particularly interested in human morality. The ancient Sumerian gods cared about sacrifices and proper rituals but weren't moral authorities in any modern sense. Greek gods were notoriously amoral. Zeus spent most of his time committing adultery and deception. But as societies grew larger and more complex, gods became more moralistic. They started caring deeply about justice, fairness, honesty, and cooperation. They promised rewards for virtue and punishments for vice. They evolved, Norenzayan argues, because groups with big gods outcompeted groups without them. Here are Norenzayan's 8 principles of big gods, the core mechanisms by which religion enabled civilization. 1. Watched people are nice people. The mere perception of being observed increases pro-social behavior. Labs experiments confirm this. Just putting eye spots on a donation box increases contributions. 2. Religion is more situational than dispositional. It's not about whether you're naturally religious, but about whether you're currently reminded of religious concepts. Subtle religious primes words like God, Scripture, Divine, increase generosity temporarily. 3. Hell is stronger than heaven. Punishing gods promote pro-sociality more effectively than rewarding gods. Azim Sharif's research found that belief in hell predicts lower national crime rates, while belief in heaven predicts higher crime. Fear works better than love for enforcing cooperation. 4. Trust people who trust in God. Religious signals indicate trustworthiness. People preferentially cooperate with religious partners in economic games, assuming they'll be more honest. 5. Religious actions speak louder than words. Costly rituals, fasting, pilgrimage, celibacy are credibility-enhancing displays that prove commitment. Anyone can say they believe. Only true believers pay the price. 6. Unworshipped gods are impotent. Beliefs require rituals to remain psychologically effective. Dormant beliefs don't influence behavior. Active, practiced beliefs do. 7. Big gods for big groups. The size and power of gods correlates with social complexity. Hunter-gatherer bands have local spirits. Agricultural chiefdoms have regional deities. Empires have universal gods. 8. Religious groups cooperate to compete. Pro-social religions outcompete less pro-social alternatives. The groups that pray together stay together and conquer their neighbors. Historians still argue whether Norenzayan overstates religion's causal role in civilization's emergence. Some point out that large-scale cooperation also required writing, bureaucracy, military organization, and material surplus, not just belief in big gods. Others note that some large societies, like China at certain periods, maintained order through Confucian ethics and state power rather than omniscient deities. But even critics acknowledge religion's role as social glue. The supernatural punishment hypothesis, developed by Dominic Johnson and others, posits that fear of divine retribution evolved as a cultural tool to overcome limitations of human monitoring. Humans can't watch everyone all the time. Humans make mistakes, can be bribed, sometimes don't care. But God? God never sleeps, never blinks, can't be fooled, judges perfectly. Unlike humans, divine punishers can be omniscient, omnipotent, infallible, and untouchable. That's the advantage of supernatural punishment over human enforcement. It's inescapable. Research confirms this. Sheriff and Johnson's studies show that viewing God as more punishing, less loving, was reliably associated with lower levels of cheating. People who emphasize God's wrath behave more honestly in anonymous situations than people who emphasize God's love. And at the national level, the proportion of people believing in hell negatively predicts crime rates, while belief in heaven positively predicts crime. Hell keeps you honest. Heaven just makes you complacent. Here's a quirky detail from historical analysis. Richard Sosis studied 83 American communes from the 19th century, both religious and secular. The question: which ones survived longest? Communes demanding costly sacrifices, dietary restrictions, fasting, celibacy, distinctive dress, daily rituals lasted longer than communes without these requirements. But crucially, this only worked for religious communes. Secular communes with equally costly requirements still failed quickly. Why? Because religious framing transformed the costs into sacred commitments. Giving up meat for God feels meaningful. Giving up meat for abstract principles feels arbitrary. The religious communes filtered out free riders through costly signaling while simultaneously providing transcendent justification for the sacrifice. William Irons developed the costly signaling theory of religion, arguing that expensive, hard-to-fake religious behaviors signal commitment to group norms. If you're willing to pray 5 times a day, fast for a month, donate 10% of income, you're probably not going to cheat your fellow believers in smaller matters. The cost itself proves sincerity. And groups that can identify sincere members while excluding free riders have massive advantages in collective action problems. You're back in now, watching a religious procession. Hundreds of people are marching toward the ziggurat, carrying offerings, chanting hymns to Nana, the moon god. They're strangers to each other. Farmers from different villages, merchants from different families, artisans from different guilds. But they're united by shared belief that Nana sees their devotion and judges their worthiness. That belief makes them trustworthy to each other. That trust enables trade between strangers. Trade enables specialization. Specialization enables surpluses. Surpluses enable cities. Cities enable civilization. Emil Durkheim, the founder of sociology, argued in 1912 that religion creates collective effervescence, intense communal emotions that emerge during ritual gatherings. Most of life is mundane, profane in Durkheim's terms. But when the tribe gathers for ceremony, something changes. Energy builds, emotions amplify, people feel connected to something larger than themselves. Certain objects, times, and places become sacred, set apart from ordinary existence. And that feeling of sacredness, Durkheim argued, is actually the feeling of the group's power, projected onto imagined supernatural beings. The mechanism is still visible today in secular contexts. Concert crowds, sports stadiums, political rallies, all generate Durkheimian collective effervescence. You're swept up in communal emotion, feeling part of something bigger, experiencing transcendence without theology. The brain doesn't care whether you're worshiping God or your favorite band. The social bonding mechanism is the same. Robin Dunbar's research on social brain size adds another dimension. Dunbar's number, approximately 150, represents the cognitive limit on stable social relationships. Our neocortex can only track about that many people's individual personalities, reputations, and relationships. Beyond 150, relationships become impersonal and require external structures to maintain cohesion. Religion, Dunbar argues, is one of those structures. Shared beliefs and rituals extend trust beyond kin networks and personal acquaintances, enabling cooperation in groups far larger than primate brains evolved to handle. Dunbar's analysis of 19th century utopian communities found that religious communes could grow larger and lasted longer than secular ones precisely because religious rituals stimulate the endorphin system, chemically bonding members the way grooming bonds primates. Singing hymns together produces similar neurological effects to huddling together for warmth. It's social grooming at scale. And remember Göbekli Tepe from earlier, the temple built before agriculture? It's the ultimate evidence for religion's civilizing role. No food surplus preceded it. No cities existed yet. No writing or pottery or domesticated plants. Just hunter-gatherers who mobilized hundreds of workers across generations to build something sacred. The social organization required to construct Göbekli Tepe likely drove the transition to agriculture, not the other way around. Religion didn't follow civilization. Religion created it. You are watching a chimpanzee. Not in a zoo, but in the wild, in the Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania, where Jane Goodall spent decades observing them. It's late afternoon, and you hear rushing water ahead, a waterfall maybe 20 feet high crashing into a pool below. The chimps in the forest hear it too. They approach slowly, and as they get close, something changes in their demeanor. Their hair stands on end, they sway rhythmically. One male throws a rock into the water. Another swings through the spray on a vine. They sit at the edge, watching the waterfall for minutes at a time, seemingly transfixed. Goodall described these waterfall dances in her field notes, noting that the chimp's behavior suggested something like awe. They weren't drinking. They weren't playing in any normal sense. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritualized display, responding to the waterfall's power with what looked like reverence. Goodall later wrote, "I can't help feeling that this waterfall display, or dance, is perhaps triggered by feelings of awe and wonder. If the chimpanzees could speak, might that lead to one of the early animistic religions?" She's careful not to overstate. She's describing a possibility, not a certainty. But the question lingers. Is this the seed of something religious? Or are we projecting human categories onto primate behavior? Animals clearly have precursors to some capacities required for religion. Elephants engage in elaborate responses to death. They stand vigil around deceased herd members, touching and smelling carcasses with their trunks, focusing especially on skulls and tusks. They revisit remains repeatedly, sometimes carrying dead calves for days. They cover bodies with branches and soil. George Whittemire of Save the Elephants, who has studied thanatological behavior in African elephants for years, notes, "Elephants have respect for their dead, but their interaction with their dead is not something we fully understand." Is this mourning? Ritual? Proto-religious behavior? Or are we anthropomorphizing complex but purely emotional responses? The challenge is that we can't ask the elephants what they're experiencing. We observe behavior and infer mental states, but inference is always uncertain when the subjects can't report their inner lives. Great apes pass some theory of mind tests, suggesting they understand that others have mental states different from their own. A 2016 study by Kano, Krubanier, and others used eye tracking to show that chimpanzees, bonobos, and orangutans anticipate where an actor will search based on false beliefs. The classic test for understanding that others can hold incorrect beliefs about reality. Frans de Waal called this a genuine breakthrough, demonstrating the mental continuity between great apes and humans. If apes understand false beliefs, they have the cognitive foundation for imagining invisible agents with their own intentions, a key building block for religious thought. But understanding false beliefs isn't the same as inventing gods. The gap between recognizing that another individual might believe something false and imagining a cosmic intelligence who created the universe and judges moral behavior is vast. Animals might have the precursors, the cognitive foundations, but they don't seem to build theological superstructures. Historians still argue whether searching for animal religion is meaningful or whether we're imposing human-specific categories on fundamentally different minds. Some comparative psychologists think we're looking for the wrong things. That if animals have something religion-like, it would be so alien to human religion that we wouldn't recognize it. Others think religion requires cognitive capacities animals simply don't have: symbolic language, narrative thinking, abstract reasoning about unseen agents. BF. Skinner's famous 1948 experiment with pigeons raised provocative questions about proto-superstition. Skinner delivered food pellets to pigeons at random intervals, regardless of what the pigeons were doing. The pigeons developed idiosyncratic, ritualistic behaviors, turning counterclockwise, head-tossing, pendulum movements, as if their actions were causing the food to appear. Skinner called this superstitious behavior, interpreting it as the pigeons falsely linking their random actions with the reward. Later reinterpretations suggest it wasn't superstition so much as species, typical foraging behaviors being elicited by food anticipation. Still, the question remains, if pigeons can form spurious causal associations between their behavior and outcomes, is that a rudimentary version of the same cognitive glitch that makes humans perform rain dances and pray for good harvests? Or is it a superficially similar phenomenon arising from completely different mechanisms? Here's what animals seem to lack. For anything recognizably religious, symbolic language to communicate about experiences, narrative capacity to construct stories about supernatural beings, cultural transmission mechanisms for passing religious concepts across generations, and abstract reasoning about unseen agents with complex intentions. Mark Bekoff, Professor Emeritus at University of Colorado, studies animal emotions and advocates for what he calls compassionate, heartfelt, holistic science that acknowledges the possibility of animal spirituality. But even he distinguishes animal capacities from human religious complexity. Dogs don't appear to have creation myths. Dolphins don't build temples. Crows don't pray, despite their remarkable intelligence. Ravens can plan for the future, use tools, understand third-party relationships, but they don't form religions. Intelligence alone isn't sufficient. You need something else. Maybe language, maybe culture, maybe that specific cognitive architecture that makes humans prone to seeing agents and purposes everywhere. But here's a quirky detail that complicates the picture. Some animals do engage in behaviors that look ritualistic without obvious functional purposes. Certain birds perform elaborate displays that seem purely aesthetic. Bowerbirds build and decorate intricate structures to attract mates, arranging colorful objects with what looks like artistic sensibility. Elephants sometimes move large stones repeatedly to specific locations for no clear reason. Are these meaningless behaviors, pre-adaptations for later cultural development, or something we don't have categories to understand? You're back at that waterfall with the chimpanzees now, watching them perform their mysterious dance. Their hair is bristling, their movements are synchronized, they're clearly responding to the waterfall as something significant. What are they feeling? Is it awe, the sense of confronting something powerful and incomprehensible? Or is it just heightened arousal in response to a novel, intense stimulus? Without language, we can't know. We observe the behavior and project our categories onto it, always uncertain whether we're discovering something universal or inventing something human-specific. Donald Brown's catalog of human universals, compiled in '91, lists features present in all known human societies. Religion appears on that list, as do religious rituals, propitiation of supernatural beings, soul concepts, death rituals, mourning, divination, and magic. Every human culture ever documented has had something recognizably religious. The same cannot be said for any animal species. Chimps at waterfalls are suggestive but not conclusive. Elephants' mourning is moving but not theological. A 2023 international study of 114 societies found societies overwhelmingly more likely to have supernatural beliefs concerning natural phenomena, weather, disease, death, than social ones. The interpretation, religion originally emerged to explain nature, to make sense of forces beyond human control, to provide causal stories for events that felt significant but were not understood. Animals experience nature. Animals face disease and death. But they don't, as far as we can tell stories about why these things happen. They react, adapt, grieve perhaps, but they don't construct explanatory narratives involving invisible agents with intentions. The Piraha people of Brazil represent a potential human exception that might shed light on the question. Linguist Daniel Everett, who spent 30-plus years with them, claims they lack religion, creation myths, afterlife beliefs, and words for past and future. They weren't superstitious in the way you might expect an Amazonian tribe to be. The Pirahas have shown me that there is dignity and deep satisfaction in facing life and death without the comfort of heaven or the fear of hell. However, Everett acknowledges the Piraha discuss jungle entities. He initially mistranslated as spirits. Whether they constitute supernatural beliefs remains debated. The exception may be definitional rather than substantive. Maybe the Piraha have religion, but it doesn't look like what we expect religion to look like. Or maybe they really are a human culture without religion, proving that while religion is nearly universal, it's not absolutely inevitable. Children, meanwhile, seem to be born believers. Cross-cultural developmental research shows kids naturally develop animistic thinking, attributing life and intention to inanimate objects. They're promiscuous teleologists, seeing purpose in everything. They're intuitive dualists, separating minds from bodies. They develop agency detection early. Deborah Kellerman's research shows even children raised in atheistic households display these tendencies. Paul Bloom summarizes, "Creationism and belief in God is bred in the bone. So, animals might have the foundations, the building blocks, the proto-capacities. But humans alone seem to have assembled those pieces into full religious systems. Whether that's because we have language and culture, or because we have some unique cognitive architecture, or because our particular evolutionary history selected for religiosity, remains an open question. What's clear is that the chimpanzee at the waterfall, remarkable as its behavior is, isn't praying. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But watching it, you can glimpse the raw materials from which something like prayer might eventually emerge. You're 5 years old, and you've just asked your parent where the rain comes from. Your parent explains, "Water evaporates from oceans, forms clouds, condenses, and falls back down. You nod, but that's not what you asked. You asked why rain exists. What's its purpose? Why did someone make it rain? And your parent has to gently correct your assumption. Nobody made it rain, it just happens. But your 5-year-old brain resists that answer. Everything has a purpose. Rocks are pointy so animals can scratch. Mountains exist so people can climb. Rain exists to water plants. Someone designed all this. It's obvious. This is what researchers call promiscuous teleology, and it's universal in young children across cultures. Kids naturally see the world as purposefully designed, with functions and intentions built into nature. Deborah Kelemen at Boston University has spent decades documenting this tendency. Show preschoolers natural objects and ask why they exist. Adults will give mechanistic explanations: erosion, geology, evolution, physics. Children give teleological explanations. They exist for some purpose, because someone made them that way. And crucially, this isn't something parents teach. Kelemen studied children raised in explicitly secular households by atheist parents who carefully avoid religious language. The kids still exhibit promiscuous teleology. They still default to design explanations. They're, in Kelemen's term, intuitive theists. Here's what this suggests. Belief in design, and by extension belief in a designer, isn't culturally imposed on blank slate minds. It's the default output of normal human cognitive development. You have to learn to think mechanistically. Teleological thinking is where every human brain starts. And if teleological thinking is natural, if design assumptions are inevitable, then the leap to believing in God isn't a leap at all. It's just making explicit what your brain already assumed implicitly. Paul Bloom at Yale argues humans are natural-born dualists. By age 3 or 4, children distinguish between brain functions and mental experiences. Show them a brain and ask if it helps with math problems. They say yes. Ask if the brain loves mommy or feels sad. They say no. Those mental activities feel like something separate from the physical organ. This intuitive dualism, the sense that minds are different from bodies, that consciousness is something beyond neurons, makes belief in souls, ghosts, spirits, and gods psychologically effortless. Jesse Baring's experiments show we cannot imagine our own non-existence, even as children. He used puppet shows where a puppet mouse gets eaten by a puppet alligator. Then he asks kids, now that the mouse is dead, does it still need to eat? Does it still have a brain? Is it still hungry? Does it still love its mother? Young children get the biological parts right. The dead mouse doesn't need food, doesn't have a working brain, but they attribute continuing mental states. It still loves its mother, still has feelings. Baring's interpretation, consciousness, is the only thing our brains have ever experienced, so we can't model its absence. Death becomes a transition to a different kind of consciousness rather than cessation of consciousness. By age 5 or 6, children across cultures distinguish human limitations from divine powers. God doesn't need to sleep. God can't make mistakes. God knows things without being told. These concepts emerge early and develop similarly across wildly different religious traditions. Christian kids, Muslim kids, Hindu kids all converge on similar ideas about what makes divine beings special. They're not just powerful humans, they're categorically different, with abilities that violate ordinary constraints. Historians still argue whether these developmental patterns prove religion is hardwired or just show that certain cognitive biases make religious concepts easy to acquire once culturally transmitted. The debate hinges on innateness. Are we born religious, or born with minds that make religion highly learnable? The evidence leans toward the latter. Kids aren't born believing in specific gods, but they're born with cognitive tendencies that make God concepts feel natural once introduced. Studies on children's biological versus spiritual concepts of death reveal something fascinating. Kids typically develop biological understanding first, then layer spiritual beliefs on top. By age 6 or 7, most children understand that dead people's bodies stop working. No heartbeat, no breathing, no brain activity. But separately, and sometimes later, they'll also express belief that dead people go to heaven, watch over the living, or continue to exist as spirits. The two frameworks coexist without apparent contradiction. Adults do this too, of course. You can intellectually understand brain death while emotionally believing grandma is looking down from heaven. Here's a quirky detail from cross-cultural research. Children in religious households and children in secular households show similar patterns of magical thinking until about age 7 or 8, when cultural input starts diverging their beliefs. Before that threshold, all kids believe in invisible agents, purpose-driven nature, and mind-body dualism at similar rates. Culture doesn't create the tendency, it shapes which specific invisible agents get believed in and how elaborate the theology becomes. A 2014 literature review titled, "More Studies Show Children Are Wired for Religious Belief," summarizes the evidence. Children seem naturally predisposed to believe in supernatural agents, to see natural phenomena as designed, and to treat agency detection as a first-pass explanation for ambiguous events. The review emphasizes that this isn't about truth claims, it's about cognitive architecture. Whether God exists or not, children's minds are structured in ways that make God belief feel intuitively correct. Donald Brown's list of human universals includes not just religion, but specific religious components: belief in the supernatural, religious ritual, propitiation of supernatural beings, soul concepts, death rituals, mourning, divination, magic, and more. These aren't features of some cultures, they're features of all cultures. No known human society lacks religion entirely. Not contemporary cultures, not historical cultures, not archaeological cultures. Religion is as universal as language, kinship systems, and tool-making. Scholars debate the Piraha exception mentioned earlier. Daniel Everett's claim that this Amazonian group lacks religion. But even if true, one exception out of thousands of cultures only proves the rule. And Everett's own descriptions mention the Piraha discussing jungle spirits they perceive, which sounds a lot like supernatural belief even if it doesn't fit Western religious categories. Maybe they don't have religion in the sense of organized doctrines and institutions, but they still have supernatural concepts. The near universality of religion suggests it emerges reliably from human nature, not from particular cultural accidents. Evolutionary biologist Dominic Johnson states bluntly, "Atheism is not a battle just against culture, but against human nature." His point isn't that atheism is impossible. Obviously, atheists exist, and some societies are increasingly secular. His point is that atheism requires actively overriding cognitive defaults. Religious belief is what you get when human cognition develops normally without intervention. Atheism is what you get when education, scientific training, and deliberate skepticism counteract natural tendencies. You're watching a child now, maybe your own kid or a niece or nephew, drawing pictures of family. They draw mom, dad, siblings, pets, and then they draw grandma who died last year. You ask, "Where's grandma?" They point to the sky in their picture. "In heaven," you ask. "Does grandma watch you?" They nod. "Can grandma see what you're doing?" Another nod. This child has been told grandma died, understands what death means biologically, the body stops working, but simultaneously believes grandma persists as a conscious entity somewhere else, watching and caring. This isn't cognitive failure. This is human cognition operating as designed, generating beliefs that make death manageable, that preserve relationships beyond physical presence, that populate the universe with invisible watchers who care about us. The cognitive science of religion suggests faith isn't something you have to learn from scratch. It's something your brain will generate spontaneously if given any cultural scaffolding whatsoever. Children are born believers, not in specific gods, but in a world saturated with agency, purpose, and invisible minds. Specific religions just fill in the details. You're alone in your house, late at night when you hear a crash from the kitchen. Your heart rate spikes before you've even consciously registered the sound. You freeze, listening. Was it the cat? Did something fall? Did someone break in? Your brain cycles through possibilities at lightning speed, but notice what it does. It assumes agency first. It doesn't calculate wind patterns or structural settling probabilities. It thinks, someone did that. Even when you know rationally that 99% of household noises have mundane explanations, your ancient alarm system defaults to agent detection because for 2 million years, that strategy kept your ancestors alive. This is where we've been building toward, the synthesis of everything discussed so far. Hyperactive agency detection creates gods, but why do those gods persist? Why don't people grow out of them the way they grow out of belief in Santa Claus? Why does every human culture independently develop religion? And most importantly, how did believing in invisible watchers transform scattered bands of primates into civilizations capable of building cities, writing laws, and cooperating with millions of strangers? The answer, increasingly, looks like this. Faith exists because human brains are wired to overdetect agency. Those false positive detections get culturally codified into gods and spirits. Those beliefs happen to solve the cooperation problem for large groups and groups with effective religious systems outcompete groups without them. Religion isn't just a cognitive accident, it's an accident that turned out to be useful enough that it became universal. Start with the brain mechanisms. You've got HADD, hyperactive agency detection, generating false positives whenever ambiguous stimuli appear. Thunder? Someone's angry. Disease? Someone's punishing you. Good luck? Someone's favoring you. Your brain cannot help but attribute events to agents because that's what brains evolved to do. Add theory of mind, the ability to model what others are thinking, and you can project complex intentions onto those agents. They're not just there. They want things, they have plans, they respond to your behavior. Layer on intuitive dualism, the feeling that minds are separate from bodies, and suddenly invisible agents become not just possible, but expected. If minds can exist without bodies in your intuitive ontology, then gods are just a natural extension. They're minds without the constraints of bodies. Omniscient because they're not limited by sense organs. Eternal because they don't have bodies that decay. Powerful because they're not bound by physics. Add promiscuous teleology, the tendency to see everything as designed for purposes, and you get a universe that feels intentionally created. Rivers exist to provide water. Mountains exist to provide boundaries. Seasons exist to enable agriculture. And if everything has purposes, then someone must have assigned those purposes. Design implies a designer. Purpose implies an intender. The cognitive architecture that makes you see faces in clouds and hear voices in wind also makes you infer a cosmic intelligence behind existence itself. Now add mortality salience, the existential terror that comes from knowing you're going to die. Your brain literally cannot simulate its own non-existence, which creates the persistent intuition that consciousness must continue somehow. And what do religions offer? Answers to death, heaven, reincarnation, ancestral spirits, eternal souls. Every religion provides some framework for understanding mortality in ways that make it bearable. Terror management theory shows that even unconsciously, even in atheists, death anxiety drives supernatural belief. It's a psychological need as fundamental as food or shelter. But here's where it gets interesting. These cognitive biases alone wouldn't create civilization. Lots of false beliefs persist without building cities. What makes religion special is that it happened to solve a crucial problem our ancestors faced: how to cooperate with strangers at scale. Small groups, family bands, tribes, villages where everyone knows everyone can cooperate through reputation tracking. If you cheat me, everyone hears about it and you're ostracized. Reputation works fine for groups up to about Dunbar's number, 150 people. But beyond 150, reputation breaks down. You can't track everyone's history. You can't verify everyone's trustworthiness through personal experience. Strangers are by definition people whose reputations you don't know. And yet civilization requires cooperating with strangers. You need traders from distant villages, soldiers from different clans, workers you've never met. How do you trust them? Enter big gods. Omniscient deities who watch everyone, even in private, even when no humans are present. If you believe God sees you stealing from the communal grain store, you don't steal. If you believe God punishes cheaters, you cooperate honestly. If you believe everyone else shares your fear of divine judgment, you trust them more readily. Religion transforms the cooperation problem by adding a supernatural surveillance system that never sleeps, never blinks, cannot be fooled, and enforces rules perfectly. Historians still argue whether religion was necessary for civilization or just one possible solution among many. But the archaeological evidence is striking. Large-scale cooperation appears after evidence of religious structures. Göbekli Tepe, remember, was built before agriculture, before cities, before writing. Religion came first, creating the social organization that made everything else possible. The temple preceded the city. Ara Norenzayan's Big Gods framework explains the mechanism. Groups with moralizing, punishing deities cooperate better than groups with amoral nature spirits. They trust each other more, cheat less, build larger coalitions. Over time, those groups expand, conquer, absorb, or inspire neighboring groups. The religious groups grow while the non-religious groups remain small or disappear. It's cultural evolution, and religion is the trait being selected for. Costly rituals serve as credibility-enhancing displays, expensive signals that prove commitment. If you're willing to fast for a month, pray 5 times daily, donate 10% of income, or sacrifice your firstborn son, Symbolically, post-Abraham, you're probably genuinely committed to the group's values. Free riders won't pay those costs. So, religious groups can identify true believers and exclude cheaters, creating high-trust networks that outperform low-trust alternatives. Richard Sosis's analysis of 19th century communes confirms this. Religious communes demanding costly sacrifices survived longer than secular communes with similar requirements. The religious framing made the costs feel meaningful rather than arbitrary. And meaningful sacrifices filter out the uncommitted while bonding the committed more tightly together. You're standing at the base of a pyramid now. Maybe in Egypt, maybe Mesoamerica, doesn't matter. Thousands of workers moved millions of stone blocks over decades to build this monument. Why? Not for practical reasons. Pyramids don't produce food or shelter. They do something else. They demonstrate collective commitment to shared beliefs. They prove a society can coordinate vast resources toward transcendent goals. They signal to neighboring groups, we are united, we are powerful, we serve gods who make us strong. Don't mess with us. And those signals work. Groups that can build pyramids can also field armies, organize defenses, establish trade networks, administer justice. The same collective commitment that builds monuments also builds civilizations. Religion is the glue holding it together. Not the only glue, but a particularly effective one because it taps into cognitive biases, provides existential comfort, enables trust among strangers, and enforces cooperation through supernatural surveillance. This doesn't mean religion is true, it means religion is useful. Evolution doesn't care about truth, it cares about survival and reproduction. If false beliefs increase your fitness, they get selected for as readily as true beliefs. And religious beliefs, however false they might be, metaphysically, clearly enhanced group survival. The societies with effective religions conquered the societies without them. We're descended from the believers, not the skeptics. But here's the philosophically tricky part. Even if religion evolved because it's useful rather than because it's true, that doesn't prove it's false. Maybe there really are gods, and evolution built us to detect them accurately. Maybe the cognitive biases that make us see agency everywhere are finely tuned to a universe actually populated by agents. Maybe faith is both psychologically useful and metaphysically accurate. Science can't adjudicate that question. It can only describe the mechanisms by which faith operates and the effects it produces. What's clear is that faith exists across cultures, emerges reliably in development, activates consistent brain regions, shows genetic heritability, reduces death anxiety, enables large-scale cooperation, and played a crucial role in civilization's emergence. Whether the gods humans believe in are real or imagined, the impulse to believe appears to be hardwired into what makes us human. You can reject specific religious claims, but escaping the cognitive architecture that generates those claims is far harder. Because that architecture isn't a bug, it's how human minds work. You're drifting now, the information settling, your mind making connections you hadn't noticed before. All these pieces, the hyperactive agency detection, the God modules that don't exist as single spots but as distributed networks, the genetic predispositions, the death anxiety, the social glue of big gods. They're all facets of the same fundamental truth humans are built to believe. Not in any specific god or doctrine, but in the possibility of invisible agents, unseen watchers, transcendent meanings, purposes written into nature. Whether that's because gods are real and we're perceiving them accurately, or because believing in gods helped our ancestors survive, the result is the same. Faith feels natural. Disbelief feels forced. Think about what that means. Every ancestor you have going back 200,000 years believed in something beyond the material world. The ones who didn't. The purely rational skeptics, the proto-atheists who required evidence before accepting claims. They either got eaten by predators they didn't anticipate, or they failed to integrate into cooperative groups, or they suffered death anxiety so severe it impaired their functioning. They didn't reproduce at the same rates as their more credulous cousins. Your genes are descended from believers, and those genes still express themselves in your brain architecture, your pattern seeking, your tendency to find meaning in coincidence, your sense that the universe isn't quite random even when you can't articulate why. This is why atheism, despite being intellectually coherent and empirically defensible, remains a minority position even in highly educated secular societies. It's swimming against cognitive currents, resisting intuitions, overriding defaults. It's possible. Obviously possible. Many people do it. But it's not easy. It requires constant vigilance against your brain's natural inclinations, the way dieting requires constant vigilance against your body's natural desire for sugar and fat. You can override ancient programming, but the programming keeps running in the background. The research on implicit religious belief in atheists shows this clearly. Consciously, explicitly, atheists reject God concepts. But when primed with mortality, when tested with reaction time measures that bypass conscious control, even atheists show increased associations between supernatural concepts and reality. Some part of the brain, some deep and ancient part, keeps voting for belief even when the rational cortex says no. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the goal isn't to eliminate all cognitive biases and become perfectly rational calculating machines. Maybe the goal is to understand how your mind works, recognize when it's generating illusions, but also appreciate what those illusions accomplish. Religion brings comfort to billions. It creates communities. It inspires art, architecture, music, literature. It provides moral frameworks and existential narratives. It makes death less terrifying and life feel more meaningful. If those benefits come at the cost of believing in entities that may not exist, is that necessarily a bad trade? Depends on your values, on what you think matters, on whether you prioritize truth over meaning or meaning over truth. Historians still argue whether we're living through religion's decline or just another transformation. Church attendance is dropping in many developed nations. Explicit religious affiliation is falling among younger generations. The known just people who check none of the above on religious surveys are the fastest growing category in America and Europe. Some interpret this as secularization, the inevitable progress from superstition to rationality that Enlightenment thinkers predicted centuries ago. But others point out that the underlying mechanisms haven't changed. People still see patterns in randomness, still attribute intention to ambiguous events, still seek transcendent meaning, still fear death and invent narratives of continuation. They just do it without traditional religious labels. They believe in karma, manifesting, the universe providing, energy, vibrations, everything happening for a reason. They practice yoga and meditation divorced from their religious origins, treating them as purely psychological techniques while unconsciously absorbing the spiritual frameworks. They sacralize political ideologies, treating them with the same absolutism and moral fervor that previous generations directed toward gods. Maybe we're not becoming less religious. Maybe we're becoming differently religious, maintaining the cognitive structures that generate faith while swapping out the specific content. Your great-grandmother believed in Jesus watching over her. You believe in the universe, conspiring to help you if you put out the right energy. Different words, same mechanism. Invisible agents responding to your behavior. Purpose woven into events, meaning accessible through belief and practice rather than through empirical investigation. The neuroscience suggests this interpretation. The brain regions that activate during prayer also activate during secular meditation, during flow states, during intense aesthetic experiences, during moments of awe in nature. The capacity for transcendence, for feeling connected to something larger than yourself, isn't going away just because institutional religion is declining. That capacity is built into human neurology. It expresses itself somehow, whether through traditional religion, spiritual but not religious practices, intense fandom, political commitment, or psychedelic experiences that more and more people are exploring as they search for meaning outside conventional frameworks. Yuval Harari's point about intersubjective realities becomes crucial here. We've always lived in worlds of shared fictions, and we always will. Money, nations, corporations, human rights, these require collective belief to function, and that belief is structurally identical to religious faith. You can't prove human rights exist by examining human biology. You can't verify the value of currency by analyzing paper fibers. These things are real because we agree they're real, and we organize our entire civilization around maintaining that agreement. So when someone says they're not religious, what they really mean is they don't subscribe to traditional religious narratives, but they still have faith in something. In science's ultimate ability to answer important questions, in progress toward a better future, in the meaningfulness of their personal projects, in the reality of ethical obligations, in love persisting beyond biological impulses, in consciousness being, more than neural firing patterns, in something rather than nothing. Mattering. Those are all faith positions. Not provable, not falsifiable, just commitments you make about how to interpret reality and how to live within it. What the science of faith reveals, ultimately, is that the question isn't whether to have faith. The question is where to direct it. Your brain is going to generate beliefs beyond what's empirically verifiable. That's how brains work. You can direct that impulse toward gods, spirits, and afterlives. You can direct it towards secular ideologies, humanistic values, and naturalistic spirituality. You can even try to direct it toward pure skepticism, though that's harder because skepticism itself requires faith. Faith that empirical methods access truth reliably. Faith that materialism captures reality adequately. Faith that meaning can exist without cosmic validation. The atheist and the believer aren't as different as they think. Both are humans with human brains, running ancient software designed for pattern detection and agent attribution, trying to make sense of existence with cognitive tools that evolved for survival rather than truth-seeking. The believer says, "These tools lead me to God." The atheist says, "These tools generate illusions I must resist." But both are working with the same flawed, biased, hyperactive agency, detecting, pattern-seeking, meaning-generating neural architecture. And both, when honest, admit that some questions can't be answered definitively, some fears can't be eliminated entirely, some meanings have to be chosen rather than discovered. You're lying in darkness now, feeling small, feeling the weight of a universe that doesn't care whether you exist, feeling the pull of beliefs you've consciously rejected, but that still whisper from some buried layer of consciousness. This is the human condition, aware enough to ask why we're here, unable to definitively answer, forced to choose frameworks without proof, and living with the consequences of those choices. Faith isn't optional, only its object is. You open your eyes. The documentary has ended, but the questions remain, suspended in your mind like dust particles visible only in certain light. Why does faith exist? You followed the trail through neuroscience labs where monks' brains light up in prayer, to ancient sites where hunter-gatherers built temples before cities, through twin studies revealing genetic predispositions, through experiments showing that even atheists turn religious when death becomes salient. You've examined agency detection devices gone hyperactive, god genes that don't exist, big gods who built civilizations, children born believing, and you're left with a truth both simple and profound. Faith exists because humans are meaning-making machines operating in a universe that doesn't come preloaded with meaning. Faith is the bridge we build across that gap. But there's something deeper here, something the research gestures toward but can't quite capture in statistics and brain scans. The scientists can tell you which neurons fired during mystical experience. They can't tell you whether anything beyond neurons is being perceived. The anthropologists can document universal patterns of religious behavior across cultures. They can't tell you whether those patterns reflect cultural accidents or responses to genuine, transcendent reality. The psychologists can show that mortality salience drives belief. They can't tell you whether that makes belief false or just explains why we need it to be true. This ambiguity isn't a failure of science. It's the nature of the question. You're asking whether invisible agents exist using tools designed to study visible phenomena. You're asking whether consciousness persists after death using brains that can't imagine their own absence. You're asking whether the universe has purpose using minds that cannot help but perceive purpose everywhere. The question contains its own methodological impossibility. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some questions aren't meant to be answered definitively. Maybe faith exists precisely because certainty doesn't. If gods obviously existed, if afterlives were empirically verifiable, if divine justice operated with clockwork reliability, you wouldn't need faith. You just have knowledge. Faith fills the space where knowledge can't reach, where evidence runs out, where questions become too big for empirical methods to handle. It's not despite uncertainty, but because of uncertainty that humans reach toward the transcendent. Every culture develops religion, because every culture faces the same fundamental mysteries. Why does anything exist? Why are we conscious? What happens when we die? Where does morality come from? What are we supposed to do with our brief flicker of awareness between two infinite absences? Science can chip away at these questions from the edges. Cosmology explains the Big Bang. Neuroscience maps consciousness to brain states. Evolution explains moral instincts as adaptations. But the core questions persist. Why this universe rather than none? Why these laws of physics? Why does subjective experience exist at all? What makes anything matter? Science describes mechanisms. It doesn't provide ultimate meanings. Religion steps into that gap, offering stories, frameworks, assurances that the universe isn't meaningless, that your existence isn't random, that suffering serves purposes, that justice will eventually prevail, that death isn't final, that you are known and loved by something larger than yourself. Are these stories true? The scientific evidence can't say. It can only say that humans reliably generate such stories across all times and places, that generating them appears to be built into how our minds work, and that believing them has consequences, psychological, social, evolutionary, that shape who we become. Your brain right now is processing this information through multiple competing systems. Your rational cortex is evaluating evidence, checking claims, noting logical connections. Simultaneously, your emotional limbic system is responding to the existential weight of the material, the comfort or threat these ideas represent. Your default mode network is constructing narratives, trying to integrate new information into your existing worldview. Your agency detection is probably finding patterns in coincidences, noticing moments when the documentary's themes seem relevant to your own life. All of these processes are running in parallel, generating different conclusions, and you, the conscious experiencer riding atop all this neural activity, have to somehow integrate the outputs into coherent belief. That integration is what faith actually is. Not blind acceptance of doctrine, not willful ignorance of evidence, but the process of constructing meaning from ambiguity, choosing interpretations when multiple interpretations fit the data, committing to frameworks that can't be proven but have to be lived. The atheist does this too, just with different conclusions. Both the believer and the non-believer look at the same evidence. Universe exists, consciousness exists, morality exists, death exists, and construct different narratives about what it means. The research suggests these narratives aren't entirely free choices. Your genes predispose you toward or away from religious temperament. Your childhood environment shapes your default beliefs. Your personality traits, openness, conscientiousness, emotional stability correlate with religiosity. Cultural context matters enormously. Being born in Saudi Arabia versus Sweden dramatically shifts the probability you'll be religious as an adult. Brain injuries can alter religious belief. Psychedelic drugs can create mystical experiences indistinguishable from spontaneous religious revelations. Faith isn't purely voluntary. It emerges from interactions between biology, psychology, culture, and experience. And yet, within those constraints, you have agency. You can examine your intuitions, recognize cognitive biases, question inherited beliefs, seek evidence, construct alternative frameworks. You can be raised religious and become atheist. You can be raised secular and convert to religion. You can move between traditions, synthesize multiple influences, forge idiosyncratic spiritualities that don't fit standard categories. The fact that faith has biological and psychological foundations doesn't mean it's deterministic. It means it's deeply rooted, difficult to change, but not impossible to redirect. Maybe the most important insight from all this research is simply know thyself. Understand that your brain overdetects agency. Recognize when mortality salience is activating worldview defenses. Notice your tendency to see patterns and purposes where randomness prevails. Acknowledge genetic predispositions without being enslaved by them. Appreciate how big gods enabled civilization while questioning whether supernatural enforcement is still necessary. Understand children's natural religiosity without assuming that makes religion either true or false. Use the knowledge not to prove some belief system right and others wrong, but to make conscious, informed choices about which beliefs to cultivate. Because belief does matter. It matters psychologically. Religious people report higher life satisfaction in many studies, though causation is complicated. It matters socially. Communities form around shared beliefs, providing support networks that secular individualism struggles to replicate. It matters. Practically, belief in divine judgment correlates with honest behavior in some contexts. It matters existentially. Your beliefs about meaning, purpose, and death shape how you live, what risks you take, how you treat others, what you sacrifice for, how you face your inevitable end. The universe doesn't come with an instruction manual. Consciousness doesn't arrive with a user's guide explaining why it exists or what it's for. Mortality is non-negotiable, meaning is optional. Some people find that terrifying, an indifferent cosmos where we're cosmic accidents, temporarily aware arrangements of matter that will soon disperse back into entropy. Others find it liberating. No cosmic authority to answer to, no predetermined script to follow. just the freedom to create your own meaning and live by values you choose rather than receive. Faith exists because both responses are attempting the same task, making the human experience bearable, meaningful, worth continuing despite full awareness that it will end. Religion says the cosmos isn't indifferent. You're not an accident. Meaning is given, not created, and death is transformation, not termination. Secular humanism says meaning comes from within, from connection with other conscious beings, from contributing to human flourishing, from experiencing beauty and reducing suffering during your brief window of awareness. Different narratives, same function, making existence viable. The research can't tell you which narrative to embrace. It can only illuminate the cognitive machinery, generating all narratives, reveal the biological substrates of spiritual experience, demonstrate the evolutionary advantages of religious cooperation, map the neural correlates of transcendence, document the universality of faith across cultures, and show that whether gods exist or not, humans are built to reach toward them. What you do with that knowledge, whether you interpret it as evidence religion is illusion or as evidence humans are tuned to detect real transcendent realities, remains, as it must, a matter of faith. The darkness outside your window is softening now. Maybe toward dawn, or maybe just your eyes adjusting. You've traveled through neuroscience and archaeology, through genetics and psychology, through temples built before cities and brain regions lighting up during prayer. You've confronted hyperactive agency detection, making you see ghosts in shadows, genes predisposing some people toward transcendence, death anxiety driving supernatural belief, even in atheists who consciously reject it. You've watched civilization emerge around big gods who made strangers trustworthy, seen children naturally become believers without being taught, recognized that the mechanism of faith operates in secular contexts as readily as religious ones. All of this research, all of these studies, all of this careful documentation of how faith works, and the central question remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Does faith reflect reality or generate illusions? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the right question isn't whether faith is true, but whether it's necessary. And the evidence suggests, necessary for what we've been, probably necessary for what we are, possibly necessary for what will become. Human civilization. Everything from Göbekli Tepe to the space station, from cave paintings to quantum physics, emerge from creatures whose brains overdetect patterns, attribute agency promiscuously, separate minds from bodies intuitively, see purpose in nature automatically, and cannot imagine their own non-existence. Those cognitive biases generated religions that bound groups together, enabled cooperation among strangers, provided frameworks for justice and meaning, and made cities possible by transforming the cooperation problem through supernatural surveillance. Were those ancient believers deluded or perceptive? Were they responding to genuine transcendent realities or generating comforting fictions? Science genuinely cannot say. It can describe the mechanisms, this neurotransmitter, that brain region, these evolutionary pressures, those cultural transmissions. But mechanisms don't settle metaphysical questions. Finding neural correlates of religious experience doesn't prove or disprove God any more than finding neural correlates of visual perception proves or disproves trees. What's clear is that faith, however it's generated and whatever it represents, has been functional. Not just psychologically comforting, but practically useful, socially binding, evolutionarily advantageous. Groups with effective religions outcompeted groups without them. Individuals with genetic predispositions toward spirituality formed more cohesive communities, cooperated more readily, reported greater life satisfaction, suffered less from anxiety and depression. If faith is an illusion, it's an illusion that works. If it's perception of reality, it's perception that also happens to provide survival benefits. Either way, it persists because it helps us navigate existence. You're an embodied consciousness with an expiration date, aware of your mortality, seeking purpose in a universe that doesn't advertise its purposes, trying to cooperate with other consciousnesses who might cheat you, facing daily choices about what matters and how to live. That's the human condition. Faith, religious or secular, traditional or idiosyncratic, conscious or implicit, is how you handle that condition. It's the framework you adopt for answering questions that can't be empirically resolved, but must be answered anyway because you have to act, have to choose, have to live as if some things matter even when you can't prove they do. The atheist thinks he's rejected faith, but he has faith in his own reasoning, faith that naturalistic explanations will ultimately suffice, faith that meaning can exist without cosmic grounding, faith that consciousness is meaningful even if temporary, faith that morality binds even without divine enforcement. Those are faith positions because they require commitments beyond what evidence strictly demands. You can't prove naturalism is true, you can only assume it and see where that assumption leads. Same with theism. Same with any comprehensive worldview. At some point, evidence runs out and faith begins. The neuroscience of faith shows that transcendent experience is real, not necessarily pointing to real transcendent entities, but real as subjective experience, measurable in brain states, distinct from ordinary consciousness. When the parietal lobe quiets during meditation and the sense of boundary between self and universe dissolves, that's a genuine neurological event, not imagined or invented. What that experience means, whether it reveals ultimate reality or just interesting properties of neural networks, depends on your interpretive framework, which is to say, depends on your faith. The genetics of faith reveal substantial heritability, but not determinism. You inherit predispositions, not destinies. Some brains find spiritual practice naturally fulfilling, others find it hollow. Neither is objectively right or wrong, they're just different configurations of the same basic human hardware expressing in different ways. The 40 to 50% heritability in adults means genes matter, but it also means environment, culture, experience, and choice matter. You're not fated to believe or disbelieve. You're given tendencies which you can cultivate or resist. The psychology of faith demonstrates that mortality awareness drives supernatural belief at levels deeper than conscious control. Even atheists show implicit religious activation after death primes. This doesn't mean atheism is impossible. Obviously, it's possible. But it does mean atheism swims against deep currents, requires constant vigilance, and may never entirely eliminate the intuitions it explicitly rejects. You can consciously reject the afterlife while unconsciously clinging to continuity assumptions. You can intellectually embrace materialism while emotionally responding as if souls exist. The conscious and unconscious don't always agree, and the unconscious often wins when conscious control wavers. The anthropology of faith reveals near universality across cultures and historical periods. Every society develops supernatural beliefs, performs rituals, builds cosmologies explaining existence, creates narratives about death, establishes moral frameworks grounded in more than mere social contract. The Piraha exception, if it's real, only proves how unusual lack of religion is. Humans generate faith the way spiders spin webs. Not every individual spider succeeds. Environmental factors interfere. Variations exist. But the tendency is innate and universal. You don't have to teach humans to become religious. You have to actively intervene to keep them from becoming religious. The archaeology of faith shows religion preceding, not following, civilization's emergence. Göbekli Tepe stands as stark evidence. Hunter-gatherers mobilizing hundreds of workers across generations to build monumental sacred architecture before they had domesticated wheat, before permanent settlements, before writing or pottery or any other marker of civilization. The temple came first. The city followed. Religion didn't emerge as society's opiate, dulling the pain of exploitation. Religion emerged as society's catalyst, creating the organization, trust, and collective commitment that made exploitation, and also cooperation, productivity, innovation possible at scale. All these findings converge. Faith exists because brains generate it automatically, genes predispose it substantially, death anxiety drives it unconsciously, social needs reward it adaptively, cultural transmission maintains it universally, and civilizational development depends on it historically. That's not proof that gods exist. It's proof that humans need to believe in gods or something functionally similar to operate at our current level of social complexity. Whether the need creates the reality or perceives the reality remains, as always, uncertain. What you do with this uncertainty defines your relationship with faith. You can embrace traditional religion, accepting that evidence won't settle these questions and choosing to believe based on subjective experience, cultural tradition, or philosophical argument. You can reject traditional religion while maintaining secular faith in science, progress, human rights, or personal meaning. You can oscillate between belief and doubt, holding religious and skeptical impulses in tension, refusing premature certainty about questions you can't definitively answer. You can try to eliminate all faith, becoming radically skeptical, though the research suggests your brain will keep generating belief-like commitments despite your best efforts. None of these positions are stupid. None are obviously right or wrong. They're different ways of handling the same fundamental problem. You're a conscious being in a mysterious universe with insufficient information to answer ultimate questions, forced to act anyway, and needing frameworks for deciding what matters and how to live. Faith, in its broadest sense, is what you use to fill that gap between what you know and what you need to act. Religions throughout history have claimed certainty they couldn't earn. We know God exists. We know what God wants. We know what happens after death. We know the right way to live. The cognitive science of religion shows those claims are overconfident. You don't know those things from evidence. You believe them from faith. But recognizing that doesn't necessarily undermine religion, it just makes it honest. We have faith that God exists, that our traditions point toward truth, that death isn't final, that certain ways of living are better than others, even though we can't prove it empirically. That's a more defensible position, and possibly a more meaningful one, because it acknowledges the element of choice, commitment, and trust that genuine faith requires. Similarly, atheists often claim certainty they can't earn. We know gods don't exist. We know consciousness is purely material. We know death is final. We know meaning is constructed, not discovered. But those are also faith positions, commitments to interpretive frameworks that go beyond strict evidence. Consciousness being material and consciousness emerging from material processes are different claims. The latter is well supported, the former is philosophical extrapolation. Death being biological cessation is observable. Death being existential termination is unprovable assumption. Meaning being constructed versus discovered can't be empirically distinguished because meaning itself isn't an empirical category. Honest faith, religious or secular, acknowledges its own tentativeness. I believe this. I'm committing to this. I'm living as if this is true, but I can't prove it and I could be wrong. That kind of humble uncertainty doesn't paralyze action. It grounds action in reality. The reality that we're finite beings with limited knowledge making our best guesses about profound questions, acting on those guesses, and accepting responsibility for the consequences. Whether you guess God exists or guess God doesn't exist, you're guessing. Whether you find meaning in divine purpose or human connection or aesthetic experience or intellectual discovery, you're choosing where to find meaning because meaning doesn't announce itself unambiguously. This, finally, is why faith exists, not because humans are irrational or gullible or afraid of truth, because humans are finite consciousnesses in an infinite universe, mortal beings contemplating immortal questions, pattern seekers in ambiguous landscapes, social animals requiring coordination despite conflicting interests, meaning makers in a cosmos that doesn't come pre-packaged with meaning. Faith is the bridge we build across that gap. Sometimes sturdy, sometimes rickety, always somewhat uncertain, but necessary for crossing from raw existence into meaningful life. And maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't need absolute certainty about cosmic questions to live. Well, love deeply, act justly, create beauty, reduce suffering, and face death with dignity. Maybe faith isn't about knowing, but about trusting. Trusting that your life matters, even if you can't prove it. Trusting that consciousness means something even if you can't explain it. Trusting that morality binds even if you can't ground it. Trusting that death doesn't exhaust significance even if you don't know what comes after. That trust, whatever its object, is what makes existence bearable and occasionally beautiful. The music is fading now, softer, gentler, like the last stars before dawn. You've journeyed through the science of faith. Brain scans and twin studies, ancient temples and modern experiments, genes and gods and everything between. And maybe you're lying there thinking, did I just spend hours learning that nobody actually knows? And yes, essentially, nobody knows. Not the neuroscientists mapping mystical experience to neural networks, not the geneticists finding heritability, but not specific genes, not the psychologists demonstrating mortality salience, but not whether gods exist to buffer it, not the anthropologists documenting religious universality, but not religious truth, not the archaeologists uncovering temples, but not confirming the deities they honored. But here's what we do know. You're built to believe. Whether that's because gods are real and you're perceiving them, or because brains generate comforting fictions, the machinery is the same. Your hyperactive agency detection, your intuitive dualism, your promiscuous teleology, your mortality salience, your genetic predispositions. All of it conspires to make faith feel natural, to make meaning seem woven into existence, to make death seem like transition rather than termination. Fighting that machinery is possible, but exhausting. Accepting it is easy, but maybe false. Living with uncertainty is uncomfortable, but maybe honest. You close your eyes now, feeling the weight of all this information settling like sediment in still water. The questions remain. Why does faith exist? Because humans are meaning-seeking creatures in a universe that doesn't advertise its meanings. Is faith necessary? For building civilizations, apparently yes. For psychological well-being, often yes. For truth, still uncertain, still waiting, still asking. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Not having answers, but refusing to stop asking. Not being certain, but choosing to believe anyway. Not knowing where consciousness goes after death, but living as if the journey matters regardless. The night is ending. Your thoughts are quieting. The documentary is complete.